These teams would expand and work in places like Kenya, Uganda, Benin, Botswana as well, among other places. Another major area of effort for Restoration Movement missionaries was Asia. Both the Foreign Christian Missionary Society and the Christian Women's Board of Missions were involved in mission work in Asia. They both kind of come to the same conclusion around the same time. Both of them in 1881 start making plans and then say, oh, wait, why don't we work together for this? And so the first mission team sent out consisted of 1 man and 4 single women, selected by these two societies. They started in India, and then they would bring in other missionaries from other areas as well. And so they expanded to other mission fields soon after. A team went to Japan in 1883, another went to China in 1886. Soon after that, Tibet, the Philippines were also included as well. Often, or not often, sometimes the early efforts here in Asia were done independently from the American Christian Missionary Society. Some of these missionaries felt that it would be easier to get larger support from churches if they didn't go through the Missionary Society. Remember, we're talking late 1800s, so there's still some connections between the Churches of Christ and Disciples. Those are a lot weaker. But any missionary coming to the Churches of Christ from the Missionary Society is going to get rejected. And so some missionaries wanted some independence, and so or went independent to maybe gain funds from a variety of congregations. The open membership controversy, of course, becomes really a focus because of things done in Asia. We mentioned China, of course. The Philippines was another area where there was a significant concern about open membership, which, so missionary work here kind of leads to a split between conservative and liberal disciples. The conservative wing, which would eventually become the independent Christian churches, right? While they're still apart with the disciples, they started directly supporting missionaries rather than going through the United Christian Missionary Society at this point. So, that becomes a issue because there's this open membership issue, and who's going to support missions. So there's a lot of questions of missions at this time that are tied up with the questions of identity and who they were as a movement, and what they were standing for and who they were going to be. All of that is kind of coming to a head in this mission work. The Churches of Christ as well were active in missionary work in Asia. They would send missionaries to Japan and to China, Korea. There would be, in some cases with the Churches of Christ, there would be several nationals who had gone to schools, to universities in the United States, been converted, and then went back to their homelands and started works and churches. Korea, that appears to be the major way Churches of Christ entered Korea, was through an individual who had gone to the United States and then was converted and then went back. Like other groups, of course, the Churches of Christ faced financial challenges when it came to missions because of the Great Depression, World War II, which brought struggles for missionaries as well as funding. Mission work in Japan and some parts of China was suspended, and some missionaries, like Sarah Andrews of the Churches of Christ, stayed in the field. And so this happened for the disciples as well. There's this kind of some missionaries staying, other missionaries leaving. Sarah Andrews was born in 1893 in Tennessee. She went to Japan in 1916 and stayed there until her death in 1961. So for the majority of her life lives on the mission field in Japan. She helped establish at least 8 Japanese congregations. There's possibility there might have been more. Despite that success, she did face a lot of challenges, especially during World War II. She was put under house arrest. She was imprisoned. So she was imprisoned, and then she was also under house arrest at other times. She fell ill several times. She experienced malnourishment at some times because of lack of resources. But after the war, well, even during the war, she continued to care for the poor, the sick, the wounded, to try and help out and show the love of Christ. And after the war, she operated or opened a home for widows, Japanese widows, some of soldiers and some of people that died in other situations. She also encouraged young Japanese men to go to the United States for education. Was well beloved in the area. When she died, her grave marker was erected both by Christians and non-Christians. So she had a profound effect on a variety of people. But that does reflect the challenges that a lot of missionaries have had, both within the Restoration Movement and outside, especially in the post-World War II period. And missionaries were imprisoned in Thailand and China. The Japanese army closed a variety of churches in Korea when it occupied Korea. Now, work still continued in India during the time. It continued in some parts of China during the time, but there was a lot of difficulties that people faced. When the war ended, missionaries either returned or renewed their efforts. Mission stations that had been used were reopened. Churches that had been closed down were reopened. And then missionaries started working in other places, expanded into other countries as well. However, when communism began to spread in the 1940s, 1950s, missionaries again faced renewed challenges. When the communists took over in China, for example, a lot of missionaries were either expelled from the country or were imprisoned. Many of the missionaries who left China went to surrounding countries. And so, it was a matter of, okay, we got to leave here, but we're going to still be active. Something similar happened when North Korea Korea split into two, and North Korea became communist. Ministers were arrested, churches were destroyed, and so missionaries faced a lot of challenges. In the latter part of the 20th century, there's been an increase in missionaries from the Churches of Christ, as well as from the independent Christian churches coming to Asia, interested in work in Asia. The disciples, on the other hand, often merged their work with a variety of national united churches in various Asian countries. And so instead of trying to do mission work that was distinctly disciples in nature, it was much more ecumenically focused, as we've talked about before. In Asia, there has been sizable growth, predominantly for the independent Christian churches and the Churches of Christ, because it is much more evangelistic. And a lot of that growth has been in places like India, the Philippines, Myanmar, what used to be Burma. These are the places where there have been the greatest success in recent years for Asia. There's also been efforts in Europe to evangelize, and in some respects we can kind of split this efforts between pre-World War II and post-World War II. The earliest work, as I mentioned before, was done in England, France, Denmark, Scandinavia, all places with national churches, with sizable populations that would identify as Christian of some sort. Much of this early work that was done was predominantly disciples-oriented, supported by the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. Ultimately, a lot of the work done, especially by the disciples, by both the disciples and the Churches of Christ, pre-World War II, not a lot of success. There's not a lot of people that give up their denominational affiliation and become part of the Restoration movement. There's some success in Britain, but not much elsewhere. In the late 19th century, so this early effort, largely disciples-oriented. Later 19th century, students in the Nashville Bible School, more connected with the Churches of Christ, as well as a couple of sister institutions, began work in Europe for the Churches of Christ. A lot of the focus these early years for Churches of Christ was in Germany, but again, not a lot of success. When the situation in Europe starts to deteriorate and war begins to be closer, there is a decline of people from the United States who are working in Europe as missionaries. The number of people are leaving, new people aren't coming because of just there's tension and struggle, and of course there's a question of will there be war and all those kind of things, but a lot of people kind of think that now's not the time to be in Europe, predominantly Western Europe. When it comes to other places in Europe, for example, the disciples were connected with some Russian Christians in the early 1900s. These were Russian Christians who were kind of restorationist. They had some similar ideas. They were looking for bringing about reform in Russian Christianity. They tended to call themselves like gospel Christians or Bible Christians. And so they kind of came to these conclusions on their own. The movement was started by a man named General Pashkov. Americans would later nickname him the Alexander Campbell of Russia. He had a lot of similar ideas, and so he had started this movement. And so the disciples, as they encountered this, they kind of start working together. But there's not a lot of opportunity to evangelize while Russia was under the czars prior to the Russian Revolution. Because of the way that the czars often view Russian Orthodoxy and some other things related to state religion. When the Russian Revolution happened in 1917 and World War I ended, there were some opportunities for relief efforts, but there were also other challenges because of the atheistic nature of the Russian government. There was some success in Poland due to a Polish student who studied in the United States and then came home. He served as a missionary for the American Christian Missionary Society for a time, but then also kept up the work even after he had kind of fulfilled his obligation. After World War II, however, things began to change because there is an increased opportunity for mission work. And as we mentioned before, the disciples kind of take the same approach. They tend to work with these ecumenical bodies or organizations, or they work with institutions that are already established, whether they were established by disciples or not. The first efforts of the disciples post-World War II were in France, working with a lot of what are known as the historical churches or the state churches to help refugees. So some of the denominations already present. The independent Christian churches and the Churches of Christ tended to be more focused on evangelizing from the standpoint of the distinctiveness of the Restoration movement. And so they're not as focused on relief effort. They're not as focused on working with other denominations. They're interested in evangelizing But they were also benevolent as well, but not in an ecumenical type of way like the disciples were.